I'm excited to see everybody. A lot of familiar faces, some which I may not yet know, although it seems like maybe I got a good grasp of the crowd. Just a few technical notes before we get launched. I have my chat open. My experience from teaching both in this medium and because of this class is it's a pretty frontal class. And in order for me to maintain a linear narrative that people can hold on to and be able to sort of deliver the richness of information that I believe people are after, I'm going to ask that people not jump in the middle. The chat's open. God forbid if I lose you or you want me to repeat something or a name that needs to be written down. So please put it there. I have an eye there. But because I have an eye there, I'm going to ask that sort of your thoughts and comments that you not just drop them in there because I feel an obligation to whatever gets written there and that it's going to make it difficult. I will pause. It's an hour and a quarter class. So I will pause at appropriate times to get people's questions. And like I said, we're a small enough forum here that if something is completely confusing, I don't want anyone to get involved. So that's on the technical. The other is I'm happy to see that most folks have their screens open. Obviously, you should do what's best for you. Just as a teacher, I can tell you it's very helpful to me to be able to see your smiling faces, to have the nonverbal response. Let's all practice, those of us who know what it means. What's it look like? Nonverbal response. All right, that stuff. I mean, it seems small, but it will help in the back and forth, which is so essential to teaching, which is one of the small losses to the great tool of access that we have here being in the Zoomiverse. Okay, last but not least, the big picture of the class before we get started on today's task. The class is called The Making of the Jew, and I'll engage that somewhat edgy title momentarily, but I just want you to understand that my goal is to present the arc of development of Ashkenazi Jewry. That's a big task in 6 classes. So therefore, it's going to take kind of 2 approaches. One will be a bit of a survey. We have to get a good grasp of European history at the time, because that's the context, of course, for the development of Ashkenazi Jewry. Also, I'm going to try to sort of articulate a picture of certain personalities. Right? There are some foundational personalities like Rashi, some of the Tosafists, the Tour, if these names are familiar, if they're not, God willing, before we're done. So we're going to go back and forth between sort of the big picture and then some narrow focus. And the years that we'll be spanning, believe it or not, are going to be basically between around 800 and Yaakov Asher, the Tour, dies in 1340. So it's going to be about a 500-year span. So buckle your seatbelts and away we go. You guys ready? So a couple of words on the making of the Jew. It always irks me when I hear people speak about the Jewish people coming out of Egypt, even though I do it too. It's obviously a linguistic convention. But why does it irk me? Because, of course, there were no Jews at that time. There were the Hebrews, right? They became the children of Israel, became an Israelite nation. The Jew, right, is a product of a longer process and really has its roots in exile. I'm not going to reel it all the way back. Anybody know, just offhand, who's the first person called Yehudi?
The Maccabim.
Well, no, we got before that. We just had the Megillah, right? Mordechai.
So we have Mordechai.
Mordechai.
Right.
Yehudi.
Right. And what's so important about Mordechai Yehudi is that Mordechai is not from the tribe of Judea. He's, of course, from the tribe of Benjamin. And it's in there and also in the book of Daniel that we see the beginning of the transformation of Jew from the tribal marker of the tribe of Judea toward the geographic marker of sort of the Judeans. Like, even though Mordecai technically wasn't from the Judean tribe, he became part of the Judean people, ultimately to the religion of Judaism. Now, I can't trace the whole arc, obviously, because it's not within our purview, but I want you to appreciate that the making of the Jew, when people speak about Jews today, especially Ashkenazi Jew, is a product of exile. And as such, one of the primary questions we're going to need to ask or engage is this idea of identity. And identity is a hot button topic today. It's the currency for every conflict, in our new version of, it used to be that economics was every conflict, right? That's what Marx said. All conflicts are economic conflicts. Today, all conflicts are identity conflicts. And therefore, it's worth it to get a working definition. Many of us have had a chance to learn together for a number of years, some of us. And so you may be familiar that for me, there's a definition of memory which I work with, which is that memory is the process of telling a story of the past, right? Which shapes a present identity. It's shaped by and shaping a present identity that gets us toward the future. Now, the future either we fear or we aspire toward. I don't want to go too deeply into it, but that's a memory dynamic, right? Memory always exists in the present because we exist in the present, but it's looking back. It's looking back at the past, usually through the lens of who we are, consciously or not. Now, what does that have to do with identity? The identity really is a story of the present, and it emerges out of memory, right? We are a product of how we once were, but we're telling the story in the present. Who am I now? Not what happened to me, and it's even more actively aimed at the future. And so that the question then I want to deal with is like, what's the story with the Ashkenazi? Like, what is this strange identity creature that people can point to today, right? Raise your hand if you see yourself as Ashkenazi Jew, right? Now, how many of you have ever been to the Rhineland? Maybe some of you guys are like some of you know, but you guys, okay, it always happens to me in Pardes crowds. Every other crowd, nobody raises their hand, right? Because Pardes is so exceptional, we're always going to get that kind of answer. But you get my point, is that there's an identity marker here, which has its roots in memory and the story we're going to tell. But it's primarily, it's a power in the present. This is who I am, or who we are as a collective identity. And so I want to start with the word, and we're going to go to a little bit of geography, and then last but not least in this introduction, we're going to touch on sort of the power of minhag, of custom, as really the organically Jewish approach to identity, I would say. So Ashkenaz is a funny word. It's biblical. If you look it up, Ashkenaz was Noach's great grandson through Japheth. And it shows up in the 10th chapter in Genesis. You can find it over in the first chapter of Chronicles as well, right? In the Noachide chronologies, he's one of those names that nobody would ever remember. What's interesting is we also get him showing up in the book of Jeremiah. And there in Jeremiah, we start to get a little bit more of a geographic association, because in the 51st chapter of Jeremiah, if you want to look up, it's 51:27. Ashkenaz is named as one of the nations summoned from the north to destroy Babylon. Why does that matter for us? Well, first of all, we've gone from name to nation. No longer just Noach's grandson. We now have a people adopting his name. Furthermore, north of the land of Israel, we've gotten a geographic location. And in fact, Ashkenaz, in rabbinic literature, in the few places that it shows up, it's not common usage, slowly becomes to be considered the ancestor of people who lived to the north of the land of Israel, right? In a broad arc, basically going north and west, because of course they didn't all have globes in their houses like we have, and certainly not Google Maps. So the north, but to the north, like up there, right? Now, nonetheless, by what we call the High Middle Ages, which we'll talk about the problem of periodization much later, but around, call it 1000 of the Common Era, that name has come to rest around Germany, and in particular, the Rhineland, that southwest border area of what will become France. Right? We see in the first half of the 11th century, Rav Hai Gaon, right? He is the last, not really the last, but the end of the Gaonic period. That's a story unto itself. He refers to receiving questions from the land of Ashkenaz. And his contemporary, Rashi, later contemporary, refers to both the language and the land of Ashkenaz, right? So basically, by the time our story really gets started, it's agreed upon that there's a place called Ashkenaz, and today we associate it specifically with the Rhineland, but more broadly speaking, with Germany. And one of the things we're going to have to think about is, well, how exactly does that happen? There is no Germany in the Bible. The rabbis, however, were aware. Of course, Germania was a part of the frontiers of the Roman Empire. The rabbis were quite aware, and you can find the term Germania. But why does it become Ashkenaz as soon as there are thriving Jewish communities that begin to take root there? So that actually has to do with another, modern element of discourse today. And as much as my focus is on history, those of you who we've got a chance to learn together, it's important to me that we also be able to learn about the present. And an exploration of Ashkenaz identity can teach us much about the sort of discourse today. Today, there's a lot of talk, if you're familiar with, the difference between assigned identities and chosen identities. People are familiar with this, vaguely have heard this language. It comes up a lot today in gender identity. I mean, that's where assigned identities and chosen identities have become, at least in American discourse, like a downright sort of combative issue. I'm not going to go there right now. Don't be nervous. But what's important to me is that there's basically an internal, external dynamic. Part of my identity is everybody looks at me and says, hey, look, there's an Ashkenazi Jew, right? I look kind of European. I've got the beard and the funny hat, like, okay, so fine. That's what people associate. They assign that identity. A chosen identity comes from within me. Who am I? What, right? What team do I belong to? And a lot of the smoothness of moving the world is finding some consonance between my assigned identity and my chosen identity. Hence the sort of like, I'm not getting into the political dynamic around the idea of transgender, but that's when I've spoken to people who've gone through transition, that's what they're after. They're after an alignment between their chosen identity, not chosen necessarily as choice, internal, let's call it, internal identity, and the external, and the way they're assigned by society. So when you look at the arguments around Ashkenazi identity, genetic, cultural, historical roots, right? They range from the sort of fantastically, pedantically academic to the downright anti-Semitic. And it's not a question I'm going to engage right now, but I do want to put it on the board for you to carry it with us forward. Why do people get so worked up about Ashkenazi Jewry? I mean, today, the whole question of whether Jews are white, of course, revolves around this question of Ashkenazi Jewry, right? And then there are classic anti-Semitic theories, if you're familiar with them, that that the Ashkenazi Jews aren't even Jews; they're convert. I'm not going to go there right now, right? But I want you to just sense that there's a huge element of the assigned, and that's going to be very important in the making of the Jew, because what a Jew is in European society will be much of what the Europeans force upon the Jew, right? Not just in terms of where they let Jews culturally and economically and politically survive, but their inner perception with the Christian Europe, as we'll speak about, how they understand the Jew to be. In many ways, they will project that on, and even in some places force upon the Jew that very thing which they expect to see, as opposed to the inner dynamic of what Ashkenazi Jews themselves might actually strive to be. So I want to really focus for now in the introduction on the internal. Why did the Jews of the Rhineland come to call themselves Ashkenazi? Well, first of all, it's not unique. The idea that Jews would take biblical names with them wherever they went, we can find at least one other major example, and there are a few, but the best known is that the Jews of Spain, by the 10th century, certainly were well aware that they were residents of the Caliphate of Cordoba. Right? There's a very sort of like elaborate court, and there was an international profile, etc. Nonetheless, if you ask a Jew in the Iberian Peninsula living within the Caliphate of Cordoba, where are you from? You know what he'll tell you? Sfarad. And today, the name for Spain in Hebrew is Sfarad. Where does this come from? Well, it comes once again from the Bible, from Obadiah, shortest book in the Bible, if you're ever looking for a good book to read, one chapter, right? And there at the end of Obadiah, there's a verse that says, it speaks about the Galut Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad. Now, there's no reason to believe or disbelieve that the Sfarad in Obadiah refers to the Iberian Peninsula. I'm not going to get into that argument. My point is that the Jews of the Caliphate, and even before that, under the Visigoths, saw themselves as the Galut Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad, this exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sfarad. Why? Because it was proof of both the antiquity of their community, and this is talking about the destruction of the first temple, right? And we've been around, say, the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula since before there were Visigoths, and certainly since before there were Muslims. Number two, the nobility of their community, right? We're the Galut of Yerushalayim. Right? If you know anything about Spanish Jewish history, they perceive themselves, and often were perceived by others, as the spiritual intellectual elite of the Jews. So the usage of Ashkenaz for the Rhineland is similar, if less specific, right? It's not a claim to antiquity or nobility. Rather, it basically defines what I'll call the narrative boundary of their story, right? Because the Jew who emerges in Israel, the Jew who emerges in Europe will still be living the story of Israel. The story of Israel starts where? Again, when Abraham came from Urim, maybe it starts in Egypt, but it revolves around the land of Israel. But once exile comes, you might have thought that story was over, right? Israel was left behind. The Jew goes out and wanders, and the Jew has no home. In fact, that's what Christian and even Muslim society will say, right? But the Jews themselves understood a continuity between the biblical story and its sense of name and place and wherever they found themselves. So therefore, when these Jewish communities that began to thrive and ultimately will become a center of Jewish life in the Rhineland, they look out the window. If they see the Black Forest or some place called Germania or the Rhineland or whatever, they're off the map. You understand? They can't look to the Bible and look out the window and see the same world. There's a discontinuity there. And I've got news for you. When it comes to identity, we will fight discontinuity, consciously or not, with every tool at our disposal. So instead, with the simple act of labeling the world outside of their window as Ashkenaz, they oriented themselves both in time and in space. We're looking out the window at the descendants of Noah, somewhere to the northwest of the land of Israel. We know how we got here, we know who we are, and we know where we are. You understand that in a simple name, and I'm not claiming that there was some committee decision that sat down and said, we got to call this place Ashkenaz or we're all going to be lost. That's not my point. My point is that it's a reflection of the power that identity is a driver. And that when we give things names and labels, it is not a neutral or feeble act, it's a tremendously powerful one. So you guys with me so far? One last note on this, the identity piece, and then we're going to take off into a different angle. Joanne, you need clarification there? Yeah, briefly.
Yes, thank you. I kind of got a little lost in how the Jews, let's say, of the Rhineland picked up the term Ashkenaz between the Bible,
Right. Why, meaning I can tell you why it was important that they did so. But the question of why they took that name in particular is a mystery. And there are linguistic arguments, there are historical arguments. All we can say for sure is that, like I said, by the 11th century, both Rav Hagaon, who's over in Babylon, and Rashi, who's in situ, as we say, right, on the spot, are using the word Ashkenaz for that place. My argument is that northwest of the land of Israel was already Ashkenaz before them, at least some vague sense, and that instead of looking around and calling themselves part of Germania, it's very important for the Jews of that place, in order to keep a sense of continuity of identity, look out the window, know who we are, where we are, and what we're looking at, and thus consolidate who we are, that Ashkenaz became their term. Okay. How exactly it happened is a mystery that no one has yet been able to solve, because people didn't think so self-consciously about identity there, except in one way, which is how I want to wrap this piece up. The one way in which we as Jews did think sort of consciously about identity can be found in the 4th chapter of the Mishnah in Psachim. I don't know if any avid Mishnah learners out there, or maybe those of you who do Daf Yomi still remember Psachim, these many moons ago. But the 4th chapter is called Makom Shenahaku. Right? It's the idea that in a place where people have one custom, what can you or can you not do if you move to another place? Right? If in my town we don't work on Erev Pesach, and I go to a town where people do work, am I allowed to adopt the customs of the place where I go to? Or do I have to bring the customs of where I'm from with me? You understand? Now, this is an opening for the very idea of minhag, of custom, as definitive of identity. Just think about it. If you're the one guy in town who doesn't work Erev Pesach, and everybody else does, people are going to say, why? Oh, he's from, I don't know, Minsk, where they don't do that. You understand? Is that the Gemara, or the Mishnah in this case, assumes that place and identity are deeply bound up. And yet, when I ask how many of you actually have been to the Rhineland, even if you define yourself as Ashkenazi Jews, it was by far the minority. And so what we're already seeing is the sages understood that there's a base, for most of human history, ideas, culture, were geographically constrained just because of the limits of transportation and communication, right? Buddhism has a center, right? Why? Because that's where they're from. It spreads, we understand that, but there's a center of gravity. Even Islam, which we'll speak about, right, which spread to huge parts of the world, still has a center, right? And yet the Jews are going to very quickly, after the destruction of the Second Temple, lose that center. And so therefore, the terms of identity, which are bound up with particular customs, are going to become fiercely important. You want me to prove it to you? How many of you all ate corn last week? Oh, careful there. And you call yourself Ashkenazi Jews, right? No, but you understand, if you've ever seen, no, we don't actually, thank you very much. Good. I'm slightly joking, but I'm really not. If you've ever noticed the polemics around, like, let's just think of the language that's written in the Constitution, "Lelo chashash kitnio," with no suspicion that there might be kitnio. Then you can get a sense of understanding how custom and identity are so closely bound up, and how, in a world in which people lack a obvious geographic center, the adherence to the way we did it when, as a defining characteristic of the community, becomes all that much more fierce. I mean, I could also start singing tradition to you guys from Fiddler on the Roof, and you would get my point. Now, that's less relevant for us now, although you should know, historically speaking, that dynamic really begins in the Gaonic period, which is happening over in the Middle East during our time period, in this 800, 900 of the Common Era, where the difference between the Jews of the land of Israel and the Jews of Babylon becomes a very fierce battle of customs. I'm not going to go into that because it'll confuse our story, but I want you to understand that we're at a point in Jewish history where communities are losing their center, and Spain is arising. Ashkenaz is going to rise. North Africa, of course, Babylon is still there in the land of Israel. And in all these places, we're all Jews, but we do it differently. Now, that's a topic that we're going to return to at the end, but I wanted to plant it here so you can understand that the stakes of identity are always very high. Okay, Adkan, this is enough of an introduction for the question of identity. The other guiding question that's going to follow us through this process is essentially, what's Jewish history? Now, don't worry, I have plenty of recordings on that if you want the full answer. But in a simple sense, I want you to understand what Jewish history is not. Jewish history is not a subplot. It is not a subplot, right? In the same way, by the way, there's a very different stance. If anybody study history in university or anything, right? So once upon a time, there was women's history, right? Today, you have gender, right? Why? It's not just a semantic difference. Women's history was presented as a subplot. Here's real history, and here's where the ladies fit in. You know what I'm saying? It was, whereas gender is a critical lens on the whole historic view. Where are women? Where are they not? Right? Where, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go into you understand the difference, though? It's not a subplot to fit into a larger dominant story. It's a critical lens to examine the story itself in a different light. Today in America, the arguments about critical race theory is a great example of this. You could say that the history of African Americans is a subplot. You could trace it through American history. Or you could say, wait a minute, looking at all of American history from the perspective of an African American, or anyone who doesn't see themselves as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant for that matter, right, is a critical lens which offers understandings. We're not going to get into what each one particularly. You understand the distinction between a subplot and a critical lens? So the Jews in European history in particular play a very important specific role. One is, and we'll get to, they're a foundational factor. We're there from the very beginning of anything that can legitimately be called Europe. And as we'll see, therefore, we have influence on almost every major front. And I'm going to go through those. That's my major task today, for understanding where the Jew fits in the formative process of Europe. But before we get there, I want to actually specifically add what I believe to be the critical lens that Jewish history always has. We're all familiar with the notion that the winner writes the story, right? You remember this notion, except you know what? You know who that's not true for? The Jews. I mean, since the destruction of the Second Temple up until 1948, we lost more or less every battle, if we were even able to fight. And yet, we kept writing it down. We kept writing it down. Quick story, which some of you guys have heard, but it's worth it. I'll tell it to you again anyway, because it demonstrates my example. My brother's a writer for the New York Times. Should be healthy and well and keep writing. And he used to cover the Brooklyn courts, the federal courts there. And when 9/11, in the wake of 9/11, you may or may not be aware that there was a 20th terrorist. How many folks know there was a 20th terrorist, right? He didn't board the plane because his alarm clock didn't go off. Can you imagine the surprise? Like he woke up in the morning, I was supposed to bomb the Twin Towers. I slept, I can't believe, right? Anyway, they found him. And of course, he was going to be arraigned in the Brooklyn federal courts. It happened to be that his arraignment was on Ash Wednesday. True story. Now, it also happens to be that it's really true that most of the prosecutors in the Brooklyn federal courts are Irish Catholic. That's just the way it is, right? So if you're familiar on Ash Wednesday, a religious Catholic goes and takes communion, and the priest puts an ash cross on their forehead, and the custom is not to wipe it off. Okay, fine. Now here, picture this. They're bringing in this 20th terrorist who's been raised in a country where he believes that the West is in a crusading culture. And by the way, he lives in a country where they cut your head off for things, like really do it, right? He doesn't know this is an arraignment. It's a technical procedure, right? He comes in, his lawyers put in his plea, they set a date for the trial, you take him out. Nothing big deal here. So he comes in, two bailiffs have him handcuffs, takes one look at this group of white guys in suits with ash crosses on his forehead, and starts to freak out. He throws himself backwards to the floor. The one bailiff falls, the other one's struggling to stand. Pandemonium. No one knows what's going on in the court, except my brother, who, as he told it to me later, the Jew sitting on the side, writing the story. He got it all in one picture. Now, I want you to preserve that image because, especially in European history, the Jew will be the quintessential insider-outsider, right? Meaning it's one thing to write a history of exclusion, like which much of critical racial theory, right, is based on this idea that you know, sort of the American blacks were excluded from large parts of American history. The Jew was not excluded from European history. The Jew, we will see, was at the center of almost every major element in European history, and yet was always the outsider nonetheless. The insider outsider. So I want you to preserve that perspective. Also, this sort of driving question of the identity and formation, which is an internal dynamic. We're going to end with the internal, and then it's also part of the external context. This is the making of the Jew. All right, you guys ready to talk some classic history now? I think we've gone far enough. Okay, so if we're going to understand how the Jew came to be in medieval Europe, then we need to understand medieval Europe. And if we're going to understand medieval Europe, then we have to understand this idea of Christian Europe. It's not a popular term today, but nonetheless, you know, once upon a time, it was a given. Now, how did that come to be? First of all, let's remember that until the end of the 12th century, right? So, you know, so like 1200 or so, the end of the 12th century, right? Remember, 12th century is 1100s. It's always, so wait, sorry. Yes, 12th century is 1100s. It's always so confusing, especially when you get back into before the Common Era, then it's a mess. But until the end of the 12th century, the overwhelming majority of Jews live in the Islamic Empire, not in what will become Christian Europe. And even, by the way, for another 100 or 200 years, even though the population begins to shift, the economic and cultural centers will remain in Spain, southern France, Italy, right? Not classic Western and Central Europe, right? Nonetheless, Christian Europe will become the center of gravity for world Jewry in the later Middle Ages. And as I said, before it became Christian Europe, the Jews were already there. If you look at Josephus, right? Josephus, a historian of the first century of the Common Era, right? Josephus, he wasn't just a traitor, he was a liar too, right? You're familiar with these lines, right? He's the one who started out as a Jewish general during the Great Revolt against Rome in 70 of the Common Era, and switched sides and ended up chronicling not only the Roman Jewish wars, but incredible works. If you have never looked at Josephus's Antiquities, by the way, his work called the Antiquities, it's extremely important, highly worthwhile. Not an easy read, but worth it. Anyway, Josephus reports that even before the temple was destroyed, the Jews were scattered throughout the Roman Empire, right? And when we say scattered throughout the Roman Empire, it means they weren't just randomly scattered, right? They were wherever Rome had built a major, first it begins as a military camp, then becomes a trading post, then ultimately, you know, what emerged from this was a city. Now, when I say city, that's not a small word. If you're familiar with the sort of medieval European history, the towns and cities will play a very important role in the development of European culture. Remember, the word civilization comes from civitas, from the word city in Latin, right? And the Jews will be located, because medieval cities are going to grow up along those trade routes, mostly from the Roman period. And the Jews are going to be found already on those routes, clustered in what will become, in many cases, the original urban areas of the cities that grow up around them in the Middle Ages. Those will often become ghettos. It's sometimes a mystery why the original Jewish ghettos are in prime real estate of many European cities. But the reality is because they were the old urban areas. Now, sometimes in the later Middle Ages, the Jews were kicked out and, you know, forced to rebuild elsewhere. They also tended to cluster around the castle or keep at the center. And that's a dynamic we'll speak about. It's not an accident. Why? Because in the end, the guy who was able to build a castle, the strong lord, was the Jew's best bet for protection. We'll go further into it, but remember that it's the mob that the Jews really feared. The official church, the official feudal lords, again, I'm throwing out terms that we'll define, were often the Jews' best protection. They weren't their friends, we'll see, but they were their best protection. So the Jews predate Christian Europe, and they're left there almost washed up like flotsam and jetsam by the high tide of the Roman Empire. And therefore, even though the Jews will be mostly living in small rural communities, as is true of all Europeans, proportionally, they're more heavily urbanized than any other element of European society. And therefore, like I said, they'll play an outsized role in the development of what we call civilization, right? Preservation of systems of taxation and law, something the Jews are quite knowledgeable about, which we'll speak. Knowledge of trade routes and multiple languages, medicine, rudimentary science, right? These things will make the Jews outsiders, but incredibly important in the most inside way as possible. Now, a quick arc of Europe, right? The last Western Roman emperor is considered to be Romulus Augustus. He's taken out by the which I forget which sub-tribe of the Goths right now. It's blanking, but he's taken out by the Goths. We can just get away with that, right? In 476 of the Common Era, right? And after that, it's only Christianity that has the possibility of uniting Europe. And if you're familiar, Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, toward the end of the 6th century, converts the British Isles, and it's through the enthusiasm of the British and Irish priests that he then converts the rest of the German tribes of continental Europe to Catholicism. That's a story which deserves to be thought about, the impact of the British Isles and its culture through Catholicism. I leave that to you for your own contemplation. For our purposes, just as the German tribes are starting to come together around Catholicism, as opposed to either paganism or other non-Catholic versions of Christianity, right? Islam bursts out of the Arabian Peninsula, right? That's in the sort of early to mid 7th century, bursts out. When I say bursts, it's really not a joke. Sweeps across North Africa, up through the Iberian Peninsula, and that Muslim advance is stopped in 732 at the Battle of Tours. There's a classic, right? How many of you guys were forced to remember that date in some high school world? It's right. Did you still remember it, right? 732, Battle of Tours, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. Why does that matter for our story? Because in many ways, that gives birth to the idea of Christian Europe. I mean, what Pope Gregory had been doing was practically trying to make the German tribes Catholic. But nothing unites like an enemy, right? And as soon as the Muslims threatened to bring Islam over the Pyrenees, out of the Iberian Peninsula into continental Europe, now, in fact, Charles Martel much later will be held up as the great defender of Christianity, even though it's not so clear how good a Christian he was. But yeah, that doesn't matter either for history, right? He's an excellent symbol. He stopped the Muslim advance. Martel's son, Pepin the Short, I also just love that, right? If your father was Charles the Hammer, you get to be Pepin the Short, right? He founds what's known as the Carolingian dynasty in 751. You don't have to remember the numbers. I just want you to get a sense of the flow, right? And takes huge steps toward reuniting Western Europe under one rule. It's under Pepin that we see the first evidence that Jewish communities are beginning to appear again in the Rhineland. I mean, it seems that they came from northern Italy, if you're familiar with the geography of Europe, right? The sort of the Italy, not the boot end, but the I guess what's that? The knee sticking up into the Alps there. So the sense is that it was communities from northern Italy, reinforced by long distance traders that we'll describe shortly, that began to sort of revive Jewish life in the Rhineland. But in 768, his son, Pepin's son, Charles the Great, better known as Charlemagne, right, becomes, emperor. Well, first he takes the throne of Pepin, and on Christmas Day in the year 800, another date that I'm sure many of you were forced to remember, right? Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne emperor. This is the beginning of what's known as the Holy Roman Empire. And I have to say it's not holy, it wasn't Roman, not an empire, discuss, right? That's a generational thing. I hope you all got it. But it matters for us in the story of the making of the Jews. So from 800, we can honestly say there is this thing called Christian Europe. Now, it's still in an internal process of formation. And as we'll see next class, the first foreign policy of Christian Europe will be the Crusades, and that will have a big impact on the making of the Jew. But for now, right, the Ashkenazi Jewry is just coming to be as Christian Europe is just coming to be. Right, this is my contention: is that it wasn't a foreign element added from the outside; it's an essential building block. And what's my proof is that it was Charlemagne who began the process of actively inviting Jews into his kingdom, recognizing that they were critical for the economic development. Now, so
what language did they speak?
So I could just say Frankish and get away with it. These are German tribes, right? But the distinction between the German language and the Latin-based languages had already begun. That's the best I can answer to. What language they actually spoke, I'm not sure. I mean, Rashi says he calls it Lashon Ashkenaz. He calls it the language of Ashkenaz. So I could have just said Ashkenazi and made it even worse. But when we get to the story of Rashi next week, we'll speak about actually how historians of language actually look to Rashi. I'm not talking about Jewish historians, non-Jewish historians of early European languages, Renee, in your question, look to Rashi as a major, one of the primary sources of what language was spoken at that time. Because there wasn't so much a written record. Only the Jews are still walking around with multiple copies of something written in the 11th century. I mean, I've got right there on my shelf, right? I bet you do too, right? The Jews. So, okay. So now we can say that Christian Europe, yes, Henry.
What proof is there that Charlemagne invited them in?
Excellent. So let me explain feudalism, and then I'll answer. The brief answer is that, first of all, that's the story the Jews tell. It's not proof, but from an internal narrative perspective, it's how we tell our story. The broader story is that we have a series of capitularies, right? Basically legal declarations that Charlemagne wrote, which deal with regulating the Jews. And the general historical understanding, I'm going to speak out in the feudal structure here, is that the Jews were invited in by Charlemagne to add an element of commercial development to what was essentially an agricultural empire, right? But so if we now have by 800 the idea, if not the full development of a Christian Europe, that's going to have real political, religious, and sort of economic, cultural impact on the Jews. So I want to look at all three of those, right? And we're going to start really from the simplest sense with the political, right? So because Charlemagne is going to establish the essential dynamic or the essential place that Jews will occupy within the feudal structure that defines life in medieval Europe. And feudalism is a term that gets used, and it's actually got certain technical aspects, which is important for us to understand. So first of all, in essence, feudalism is a land-based system for maintaining power relationships. What do I mean? All governmental systems maintain power relationships. Just today, they're not based on land, they're based on other things. In feudalism, there's the lord, there's a vassal, and there's the fief that exists between them. Just think most simply, I'm the lord, I control all this land. Why? Because I killed everyone and took it, or because you see me as a demigod, which we'll speak about, right? It was an important part of classic German culture, right? But my land is mine. I need you and your loyalty because you got a bunch of warriors. So I will say, you take that forest over there on the other side of the river, swear loyalty to me, you will become my vassal, that will become your fief, you hold it, it's really mine, but you hold it, you understand? And we have now a power relationship, right? Feudalism will evolve out of a couple of things. First of all, there's the Roman caste system, right? At the end of the Roman Empire, they started to basically chain everyone to their post. If you're familiar with the fall of the Roman Empire, it's like, wherever you are, you're going to stay there. They chained the serfs to the land. They changed certain political positions, literally, like made it law you could not leave physically or professionally, right? So it emerged out of that. Also, the process of what's called latifundia. Ever fewer people started to control ever larger swaths of lands. Hence, you have a count controls something the size of a county, right? That's often forgotten that's where that term comes from. As a personal, things which we would consider today the size of countries were often personal possessions. That's what latifundia is, the concentration of land into the hands of very few people, as opposed to a more organic situation where people farm whatever land they can manage to farm productively, and other land is common, for hunting or fishing or forestry, right? So that the caste system, the concentration of land, and the rise, like I said, of the German heroic dynasty model of leadership, which replaces the Roman republican model. What does that mean? Classic German tribal culture believed that their leaders, their kings, were descended from the gods. And therefore, to gather around such a leader is itself, I gain status through my relationship with this sort of demigod figure. You understand? That's where ultimately the divine right notion of kings in Europe has a big root in this. That the kings are somehow, obviously with Christianity, they're not going to go the demigod route because it's a little bit too edgy for a monotheistic culture, right? But a divine right king, you can see how that's quite similar. It might even, for the average peasant, be a semantic difference for someone who is illiterate and therefore couldn't tell the difference, right? So, but functionally, like I said, it's a land-based system for maintaining power relationships based on the oath. Now, it's important to note that anything, not just land, but anything of value could be held in fief. Could be governmental offices, the rights to hunting and fishing, a monopoly on trade, that's going to be an important piece for the Jews, tax farming, right? Tax farming is an important concept to understand, right? If I, as a feudal lord, am nominally control, I don't know, all of Germany, let's just say, I don't know how to raise taxes. It's quite complicated to raise taxes, by the way. You have to know your population. You have to be able to mint money, or you have to be able to estimate their agricultural output and somehow gather it together. You understand? I got to get out there and do it and bring it back. As we'd say, halas. I don't want that problem. I want to sit in my castle and drink meat all day, right? But what a great idea. Maybe I'll give the rights to a Jew, perhaps, right? And I'll say, you can take 50% of whatever you collect. Or I'll say this way, I want 1,000 gold coins on this table by the end of the year. Anything else you get out of the peasants is not my problem. You understand? And then you show up with a bunch of the king's men. That's called tax farming, and it's not going to end well for the Jews. We'll talk about it. But these are ways in which the lord and the vassal negotiate power through the fief, and it's based, like I said, on sworn fealty, right? I like to call it, by the way, a military agricultural complex, as opposed to Eisenhower's military industrial complex, right? Meaning what? Why? Because I'll grant you land in return for your allegiance to muster armed force. The more land I give you, the more military men you're going to give me when I want to go to war. Now, something which is important to understand is that the Jews will not be landholders, by and large. Even before they're banned from holding land, the Jews have challenges from holding land for two reasons. First of all, they have an insecure position. The Jew is always perceived as not from around here. So as we'll see, it's legitimate to drive them out. You understand? So it's why would you invest in land if the local lord could just kick you out? Number two, the Gentiles are often not willing to work for the Jew. And the Jews couldn't work. I mean, when you have owned a large part of land, you want to make it profitable, you need labor. So the Jews tended to stay, even in places where they weren't forbidden from owning land, they tended to stay out of that business, right? Which made them suspect, in addition to all the other reasons that we'll discuss, in the feudal system. But it also made them the liquid element. Why? The feudal system was apt to stagnate because it was based all on land, and there was very little commercial activity. As we'll see shortly, the Jew is the liquid element, right? Who is able to help a feudal lord convert the fact that he's got 1,000 pigs and 2,000 acres of pine trees into coinage where he can either buy the luxury items he wants or pay his soldiers when he needs, right? So we'll get further into that. But for now, the structure is highly stable, even though it has its own problems in European history. For instance, if you know European history, the fact that the church was a major landholder, but didn't owe fealty to anyone but God, is a major, just if you understand that, you understand half of European history, you know? But for us, the Jews are going to be treated in a very clear way. Like I said, Charlemagne creates a very clear role for the Jew, even though, you know, history being what it is, it's never absolute. The Jews are a corporate entity, not like suit and tie corporate, but corporate in the sense of a body, right? Meaning what? They are one element. Individual Jews are not an issue of the system. It's the Jewish community who have a direct power relationship, generally with the king. In this case, Charlemagne is the emperor, although it will work out. Local powerful nobles can do this as well. Give them protection. They become what are essentially called serfs of the king. They don't belong to the king in a slave sense, but if someone injures a Jew, the Jew is going to go to the king. They're not going to take it up with whoever injures them. You understand? And it's not going to be an individual Jew does it. It's the corporate entity. Now, first of all, why do feudal lords want to deal with the Jews as a whole? They only want to deal with one Jew. And what's their major interest? Money. You don't want to tax individual Jews. You go to the big Jew and say, your community needs to give me 1,000 gold pieces by winter. And it's up to you how you get it. And there's much literature, internal Jewish literature, about the dynamics of payment, et cetera. And we'll go further into that as we speak, about the rise of leadership within the Jewish community. Now, I just want to understand, within the feudal structure, the Jews are a corporate element. They don't fit the serfs who are tied to the land. They're not part of the nobility who have control. They're certainly not in the monarchy. They're not the church. See, they're excluded from what's called the guilds, the sort of more independent economic elements that grow up in the townships. So number one, we're a corporate element, which has a direct obligation to either emperor, in the case of Charlemagne, powerful local noble. Now, that's not all bad, because that means as a corporate entity, the Jews are able to maintain their own particular system of rights and obligations to one another. Jews live a life according to Jewish law. It's an internal, organic, that's the corporate piece. And as such, by the way, it puts them head and shoulders above most people in feudal society. They actually have rights and obligations to each other, right? The average person in the larger feudal society is completely subject to power, right? At the same time, it makes them the personal property of powerful people who can be soaked, right, when desired for money, and protected when advisable. And last but certainly not least, in this corporate entity, the Jews are seen as irredeemably alien. They're not local. There's no way to naturalize into society. You can't become a feudal lord. You can't even become a serf. The only way in will be conversion. So therefore, the two C's I want you to remember is that Jews are corporate and contingent. They're corporate. There's an entity, individual Jews, even though of course they'll be powerful because individuals have power, but individual Jews in the structure matter not at all. And they're contingent. As long as there's some powerful emperor, king, noble who has taken them under this protection, they have a place. Otherwise, they have no place. And as we will see, they're periodically, literally, physically driven out from wherever they are. Okay. So, like I said, Charlemagne establishes this pattern. According, in answer to Henry's question, according to Jewish sources, he invites Moshe the Elder and his son Kalonymus to cross the Alps from northern Italy, from Lucca, Italy, and to settle in Mainz on the Rhine River. And that's the beginning of official, right? If you look in the classic internal Jewish sources, that's the beginning of Ashkenazi Jewry. The Kalonymus family will become the source of spiritual leadership in the Rhineland for hundreds of years. Now, a sense of scale is important here. The historians estimate that before the First Crusade, which is in 1096, the entire Jewish population of Germany was at most 20,000 people. Like I told you, the vast majority of Jews live either in the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, or over still in the East. Nonetheless, these Jews were invited by Charlemagne, given almost total freedom in their commercial dealings, but their status remains totally contingent. If you look at the capitularies, these sort of legal declarations that Charlemagne makes, and he was their protector, it speaks about them as a despised race. I mean, I was going to give you the text, but I don't want to dive into the text right now because we're trying to get a big picture here. But just an example, if a Jew has to make an oath, has a court case with a Christian may have to bring 3 witnesses. A Jew could be 4, 7, 9, right? Jews were considered definitionally untrustworthy, right? Having denied the truth of Christian salvation. Therefore, their oaths were often rejected, or they were made to take oaths where they were physically humiliated, wrapped in various types of animal skins or other kinds of herbs and things that were considered to be, somewhat magic, to force them to hold a Bible in their hands and basically call down curses upon themselves, right? So again, but personally connected, Charlemagne himself will have a Jewish physician named Thurgut. He'll have a very important Isaac the Jew, part of his diplomatic corps, who we'll speak about shortly, although, wow, I feel like time is flying here. So again, bottom line, the Jews are a corporate body within feudalism. They are linked to power, that notion of being serfs to the king, and therefore they're contingent. And they're this liquid element, right? This liquid element, which I want to say more about now in the role that the Jews play in the development of the economy of early medieval Europe. You guys with me? I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I'm hoping that we're good. Okay, so let's talk money, and then we'll talk religion, right? We already talked politics. We're getting all the hot button topics here. So there's a fantastic sub-story of Jewish history about the Radhanites. Anybody ever heard of the Radhanites? Right? We've all heard of Marco Polo. How come we haven't heard of the Radhanites? Who are the Radhanites? First of all, Europe undergoes in the 11th century something which is known as the commercial revolution. It's based in two things. One is surpluses in production of food, which have to do with the population. And once you have a surplus in food, there's just simply more time and energy. Remember, most people in the world, and certainly in Europe at this point, are what we call subsistence agriculture. Subsistence agriculture means that my whole purpose in life is to produce more calories than I consume. If I don't, then I die. If I do, then I have some space. If it gets soaked up on my feudal lord as taxes, or I can use it to exchange for luxury goods, or I can actually buy time to learn skills and develop a trade. We'll talk about that maybe. We're not going to get to the guilds right now, but I don't want to waste the time. But that's where the guild system comes out of this commercial revolution. So number one, there was a food surplus. Historians debate why. It's not important for us. Number two, as soon as the Crusades take place, which for us will be next week, but for the rest of the world, the first one is in 1096, the bridge between Christian Europe and the Muslim East is reestablished, right? And a commercial element, basically, Europe begins to base its economy not just on agriculture, but on the commercial revolution, which will continue until the industrial revolution of the 18th century. Now, but before the commercial revolution, there was still commerce. And in Europe, that depended upon the Jews, and not just the Jews in general, but the Radhanites in particular, right? So listen, before the Crusade, the world in the 9th and 10th centuries is split between this Christian Europe in basically northwestern Europe and the Muslim empires from the Iberian Peninsula down through North Africa and out. So the Christians are in the northwest, the Muslims are in the south and in the east. And they were really separate empires, separate worlds at many times. And it was forbidden often for Christians to go to Islam, to the Islamic world. Muslims weren't necessarily tolerated in the Christian world, but the Jews could go to both because they didn't officially belong to either, right? And therefore they played a very important role in the trade of luxury goods, right? Things like silk, sables and furs, fine leathers, expensive swords, perfumes, spices. They were making it to Europe and from Europe back to the East. How? In the hands largely of the Jews. These people called the Radhanites, right? And the Radhanites had preserved the land trade routes, which had been established mostly through the Roman Empire, right? The Silk Road, if you're familiar, most people think of the Silk Road ending with the sea route, either from the port of Gaza or Jaffa, but there is a land route that goes up through Turkey and over through Central Europe, and the Jews knew that route. There have been interesting discoveries, if you follow the news on such things, in Afghanistan, the caches of old Jewish texts. These are the way markers of the Radhanites. Now, why are they called Radhanites? Historians being what they are, there are multiple arguments. Some people say Radan is from the Persian who knows the way, right? Because they knew the routes. Others say it's from the Latin name of the Rhone River Valley in present-day France, where many of their journeys either began or ended, depending on how you look at it, right? It was called the Rhodanus in Latin. There's another historian who says actually they were based in Radan in southern Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, and that's where they're called the Radhanites. For our purposes, it doesn't matter. These weren't just the liquid element in maintaining trade, right? There's a critical element in maintaining amongst European culture a sense of what we would today call a global outlook, right? It's very important for the story which lies ahead. And this is what I'm doing in this class. We haven't figured out. I'm laying all the groundwork so we can really understand the personalities, right? That the horizon of the Middle Ages is about that big for the average person. Which, if you're a subsistence farmer, your horizon is between your field and your home, right? And even for the nobles who were living off the sweat of the labor and had at least, they weren't just subsisting, their perspective of knowledge and worldliness, etc., was very limited. The church, for various reasons, didn't have such an interest in a broad worldview, hence the fact that they kept the Bible in Latin and refused to translate it for centuries. They wanted it in the hands of their priests and administrators. Nonetheless, the very existence of the Jew within Europe, and the Radnites in particular, I'll tell you a story in a second, will maintain what we would today call a sense of a global outlook. This Jew doesn't fit. It's just not part of this small European Christian world, right? On one hand, it's historical. Look, there are the Jews, doomed to wander the earth since they rejected salvation and their temple was destroyed long ago. It's like a historical view. And they know there's this place called Jerusalem. You understand that the very existence of the Jew keeps a slightly broader perspective. And then you get stories like Isaac the Jew, who I mentioned was part of Charlemagne's court, right? At a certain point, Charlemagne sent an embassy to the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. I'm sure I mispronounced that. He's, by the way, behind the protagonist of the Arabian Nights. If you're familiar with the Arabian Nights, it was based on the personality of the Caliph, the Abbasid Caliph, right? So Charlemagne sent a diplomatic embassy. Why was Isaac the Jew chosen to head the embassy? Because he spoke Arabic. He spoke also Latin and Ashkenaz, whatever it was, Renee. I'm not entirely sure what they were speaking there. Meaning he was able to communicate. So they say that the Abbasid Caliph was so pleased with this embassy that he sent a gift back to Charlemagne. You know what it was? A white elephant. And he personally made Isaac responsible for taking care of this elephant as it walked back from Baghdad all the way back to his palace in Aachen, which would make me a little nervous. According to most stories, apparently Isaac became tremendously attached to this elephant who'd been trained to eat from the hands of his owner, etc. Whatever. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but just picture. If you want to understand the role that the Jew, and especially the Radnite merchants, played in maintaining some sense of a broader world, picture this Jew at the head of this embassy walking back into medieval Germany with a white elephant that ate out of his hand. They say that peasants came, thousands, when the rumor spread, like anybody who could walk came to see this miraculous appearance of an elephant, right? Now, I tell it to you, first of all, because it's worth it, because it's a smile, but on a deeper level, I want you to just appreciate that very liquid cultural role that even in the early Middle Ages, the Jews maintained. But last but not least, the Radnites will pioneer many of the financial instruments which are essential to later trade. Something as simple as a letter of credit, right? What do I mean? If you can call me Isaac, right? Isaac is going to leave on his embassy from Charlemagne, but he needs to make some money to do so. He's going to bring money to buy spices in Baghdad. What's the problem? If a Jew leaves Germany and trots off through the forest with 2 donkeys laden with gold coins, how far is he going to get? Not so far, right? But if he leaves with a letter from his cousin Shlomo to his cousin Yaakov in Baghdad that says, give the bearer of this letter 1,000 gold coins. He shows up in Baghdad, gives the letter to Yaakov. Yaakov gives him 1,000 gold coins. He buys the spices and brings them back, sells them, pays back the guy in Germany who has his own ways through letters, exchange, etc. You understand? That's modern banking in its nascent form. And the Radnites will be an essential part of what eventually becomes many of the instruments that allow international trade to function. So I think it's enough. I want to end on the religious notes. We have, again, just a quick review so we don't lose all the pieces. We have the political, where the Jew fits into the feudal structure. Remember, corporate, contingent, and yet liquid, because they're able to move through layers both as individuals, if not as community. Also, in the commercial sense, the Jews early on will be an essential link maintaining the Roman trade routes to the east. There'll be a bridge between the Christian and Islamic empires pre-Crusades, although we'll see next week that's going to shift radically post-Crusade. And they will also, just as a note, they're excluded from the guild system, right? Even though Jews will maintain knowledge of many trades, things like weaving and leatherworking and metalworking, they'll be excluded from the trades. And, depending on how far we get, if we talk about the shift toward Poland, which I don't think we will, but we'll speak about the emergence of Jewish guilds, right, as a parallel process. But they're excluded from that and therefore severely hampered. Hence the fact that, as many people know, Jews are forced in many ways into 2 things: not just the big-time international merchants of the Radins, but petty merchants. The wandering Jew with the sack on his back who's selling bits and pieces of everything is a archetype for a reason. And the other one, of course, is money. And that we'll speak about in probably 2 classes. Right? Okay. Last but not least, religion. You guys ready? Because the religious story is, in many ways, the most familiar, but also the least pleasant. Let me just find. I skipped around here. So here we go. Okay. Now, in order to understand the role that the Jew plays in the development of religious culture in Christian Europe, we have to have, once again, a little bit of the backstory. You know, you may recall back in the early 5th century, Augustine of Hippo, one of the early church fathers, made a fierce defense of the Jews, which may sound strange to you. But like in a nutshell, when Christianity claimed to be spiritual Israel, there were many who said, well, then physical Israel ought to cease to exist. And it could have been that the church would have waged a war of extermination on the Jews, as many of its leading lights argued that they should. But it did not. And largely because of the philosophy of Augustine of Hippo, who, I'm going to tell you this briefly because time is limited, he developed what he called the witness doctrine, right? In his great book, City of God, which was foundational to Christian thought well into the Middle Ages, Augustine quotes Psalm 59, which says, "Slay them not, lest my people forget. Scatter them with your might." He says, this is talking about the Jews. Slay them not. And in fact, the church, contrary to what many people believe, the official church will become a major protector of the Jews throughout the Middle Ages because of this doctrine. Why? Why slay them not? Lest my people forget. Forget what? Well, listen, if you're a priest and you want to prove salvation as you see it is true, you don't point in general to the New Testament, to the Christian Testament. You know what you point to? To the Hebrew Bible, right? And if you want to prove the Hebrew Bible is true, what better way than to trot out a Jew? See, Bible talks about the Jews. Exhibit A, here's a Jew. But you know what's even better? You want to prove now that your Christian scripture, your interpretation is correct? Look how lowly and suffering the Jew is. So Augustine taught that the Jews should be preserved and allowed to practice as Jews, because our very adherence to that law not only proves the truth of the so-called Old Testament, but our lowly state proves the truth of the Christian interpretation. Right? And that is a role which the Jews will fit and grow into in Christian Europe in a way in which Augustine couldn't even imagine. Right? It's part of what I call the hermeneutic battle, which is a fun term, but you can use with your friends. Right? Wait, what's hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is an attempt to read meaning out of a story. You could say it's into, out of, I'm not going to go there. Right? You're trying to interpret a story in order to understand its meaning. The Jews and the Christians, since the very birth of Christianity, have been arguing about who's telling the story correctly. Right? Who represents Yaakov? Who represents Esau? Right? Who's the older brother? Who's the younger brother? If you're familiar, if not, just understand it's been an argument. How do you read Isaiah? Is Isaiah about the past? Is it about the future? Right? You're familiar, I'm hoping, with these notes. That's a hermeneutic battle. We're fighting who has the right reading of the text. And it's not neutral, because if you read the text correctly, you know where salvation is going to come from. You understand? And so for the Christians, keeping the Jews alive, but in a lowly state, allowed to practice as Jews, although encouraged to convert, but not forced. Right? That becomes an essential pillar for the proof of the truth of Christianity. You understand? And so even though Augustine was writing this in the City of God in a time which he didn't have political power, once Christian Europe emerges, once the Pope is crowning the emperor, and Catholicism becomes, until the Protestant Reformation, the religion of Europe, this is a powerful, powerful doctrine which has long-term consequences. Ultimately, this stance of the official church protecting the Jews, if keeping them in a lowly state, is going to become known as a doctrine as what's called Sicut Judaeus. I'll write it down here because that's a Latin term that I'm sure I said wrong. Right? There will be a series of papal bulls in the early 12th century that begins with the church's declaration that the Jews are never to be forcibly converted. They're protected as a corporate body, if not as individuals. Now, that being said, official church doctrine aside, there were many. First of all, the mob is always willing to get riled up and chase the Jews, as we'll see when it comes to the Crusades. And there will be many powerful Christian leaders. Maybe the end. I'm sorry, I'm feeling the pressure of time there. There'll be many powerful Christian leaders who take advantage of that hatred in order to elevate themselves. They say, by the way, the story that in Charlemagne's time, during his battles with the Muslims, that the city of Toulouse was betrayed by the Jews, right? And when the Christians regained it, the emperor ordered that every Good Friday, a Jew had to present himself to be slapped by some official representative of the church. Now, if you think, slap just being like, potched, no, the way it's written in the Chronicon, which is a work by an early 11th century Benedictine monk, he says the following: at this time, Hugo, the chaplain of Ermich, as Easter is always commemorated there, delivered a slap to a Jew whose eyes and brain spilled out of his perfidious head on the ground. The Jew died immediately. Right? The Jew represents the betrayer. So even though the official church has a doctrine that preserves their status, just like in the feudal, notice parallel, just like in the feudal structure, there's a clear place for the Jew. It may be a despised place, but it's a place close to power. Notice, the Jew is the serf of the king. So too religiously, there's a place for the Jew, close to the official church, but despised. That's just one example of many. And the truth of the matter is, I haven't given any time for questions. I think I'm going to stop it. I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to dive into the age of the Rishonim unless we have a couple minutes at the end. But again, I want to make sure the pieces are clear. What have we done? Right. First of all, we put on the board this question of identity and the idea of Ashkenaz, with a small root in the biblical, but to me more expressive of this tremendous need that Jews at this period in history have to maintain the narrative boundaries. If you look out the window and you see Germania and the Black Forest, you're off the map. If you look out and you see Ashkenaz, then you can look to the Bible, you can look to your leaders, you can look to yourself and say, we're still in the same story, which will become critical for that hope, ultimately for redemption and the return to the land. Within the political structure, the Jew is the corporate contingent element, close to power as serfs of the king, but always alien. And within the religious, the Jew is the witness, right, to the truth of Christian doctrine, and yet will always be an insidious, perfidious Jew, right, tempting people away, as we'll speak more about when we get to the Crusades, tempting people away with a non-Christian outlook, right? Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. Questions, things people want clarified? Be helpful. Yeah, Robert, it's your hand.
Yeah, I just wondering, with the status of the Jew as a witness, as you described, how does the church deal with people like Isaac and others who've risen to some degree of status?
Well, it's a great question. Charlemagne, his son, Louis, I don't know, it was probably Louis, right? He had a major fight with an archbishop. The archbishop of Lyons in his time was Agobard. And Agobard actually wrote 4 epistles against the Jews, a major source of historical information, culturally and religiously, about the Jews. And his contention was exactly what you're saying, is that the Jews were too close to power. Right? And Louis had actually appointed a Magister Judaeum, a special member of his court, there to protect the interests of the Jews. And Agobard was so vehemently opposed to this that he actually joined Louis's children in a rebellion against him. Right, so the church was not universally fond of these powerful individual Jews like Isaac or others that were able to draw close to the court. It's a great question. Renee, I see the hand there. Go ahead, Robert, did I answer your question?
Papa.
Yeah, Renee.
I just want to give a shout out to the Jewish historical seminars that had a 3-part series on the Silk Road, 2 parts by Jacob Shushan and 1 by Professor Gary Renzensberg. And It was excellent. And if you want to see them, you can watch them on recordings and pay for them.
Oh, thank you for that.
They were excellent.
Other comments, things people want to clarify? Yeah, Peter.
It sounds like the Jews were invited into Ashkenaz and treated well, I assume, at first, otherwise why stay?
Well, it depends on they succeeded. They thrived.
All right. Was there a reverse migration once the persecution started, where they went back to Muslim lands, where my understanding is things physically were safer for them under Islam?
So we'll speak about that a little bit when it comes to the Crusades next week. And really, it's important to remember that despite the ultimate importance that the numbers of Ashkenazi Jewry will gain, and even at this point, the importance of the personalities, people like Rashi and the Tosafists, numerically speaking, we're in the realm of tens of thousands, as opposed to, in the contemporary Spain, where it was more hundreds of thousands, and you add to, North Africa and the Gaonic communities in the East. So I don't know about a reverse migration. The classic pattern of Ashkenazi Jewry, as we'll discuss, is progressively to shift to the East, where Poland, right? Like why are if I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, why is all my family from Eastern Europe, right? Because there's a shift there, and then ultimately a migration back, but that lays way ahead. Yeah, Joanne. Oh, sorry, you done, Peter?
Well, you just said it's the Ashkenaz communities in the tens of thousands. So when did the Jewish population in Europe explode into the millions that, became the Holocaust, became American Jewry?
That happens in Poland. I mean, the migration to Poland begins in the 13th century, but it really takes off. The final shift from west to east, as it were, is in some of the peasant rebellions in the mid 15th century. Yeah, Joanne.
You mentioned forget who, an archbishop in the Catholic Church who was vehemently opposed to the status of certain Jews in
Agabard is his name. It's a great one. I'm going to write that one down.
I don't think I care to remember, but anyway. So here's the thing: we forget that the church and the secular powers, if you will, were often at odds. They were in a power struggle too, right? Yes. So that the church was opposed to the, I guess maybe the church was also opposed to the help that the Jews were giving to the well-being, if you will, of the secular powers.
It's an excellent point, and I think it's one that we need to keep with us as we go forward. That I'm trying to present as like a general pattern or matrix. Let's call it a historical topography. There's feudalism, there's the church, but what you're pointing out is very important, is that the internal power struggles, the Jews will fit in powerful and sometimes uncomfortable ways, right? I remember when we had the class in Spain, which some of us learned together, I drilled into you guys, always remember the Jews are the perfect servants of power because they're diligent, loyal, and easily discarded, right? They're very good at what they do. They're very loyal to power, and when you want to get rid of them, they got no local connections to speak of, so you can just chuck them. And so what you're pointing out there, Joan, is very important. Is as the church struggles with the kings and the kings struggle with the nobilities, the Jews will pick power to side with, will often get ground in between.